What did you say? What? Well, honey, there's nothing on the keyboard that matters that can be heard over here. Do what? No, I don't need anything in it. I just wanted you to bring what was a little left in here because just a couple sips left. Good morning. Are we on? Are we live? We are live.
Sorry.
From the heart of Nashville, Tennessee. No, that's not true. We are live from the heart of Austin. Nope, that's Joe Rogan. We are live from, you never heard of it, Washington. Well, you have if you lived here, Olympia, Washington. If you know the capitals of all the states in the country, then we are live from here. And we have some control issues that are happening real quick, and then we're going to get started. We're going to take a look in John chapter 8 today. I keep wanting to say 7, but that's the wrong one. There's some reference to 7, but we're going to look at John chapter 8 today. This is the first Sunday of Advent, and that's pretty cool because it means it's Christmas time is near. We're supposed to be singing that, right? Christmas time is near. Why don't you sit next to me? No, I need you to sit next to me for camera purposes. So, if you don't mind. Okay. I want to reread something Tanya just read because I think that it's pertinent again. And go from there. But I want to start in the right verse. You started in verse 4, right, Tanya? Galatians 4:4. Is that where you started? Okay, thanks. I want to read that again. But when the completion of the time came, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law so that we might receive adoption as sons. And because you are sons, God has sent his Spirit, the Spirit of his Son, into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. So you're no longer a slave, but a son, and if a son, an heir through God.
Yeah, Abba, Father.
Yeah, you got that right. I want us to, we're going to talk a little bit about that sonship a little bit in relationship to John 8 today. I found myself looking at the text this week. You have lots to say today, aren't you? Yeah, well, that's okay, as long as he's got something pertinent to say. Children's ministry unfolding right before us. I want to talk about conflict, chatter, and cure. So I actually had another week of C's, or of an allegory that works together. Because I found something interesting while looking at the story of the stoning, or the attempted stoning, of the woman caught in sin. And it struck me this week, there's really one big thing I want us to walk away from in this conversation today. And what struck me was the way and the different ways in which the people are reacting in the situation. So in chapter 7, we have a battle that's kind of going on here. I'm going to back up a chapter real fast, just kind of give some context to what's going on here. And in chapter 7, basically we have an argument that's happening as to who is it that Jesus is? And it's kind of the who do you say I am kind of conversation. You're just into it right now. I'm going to pretend like my mic is really focused on me and you're not that audible. We're just going to pretend that way. Is that okay, Leo? Right, here, just go ahead.
Preach?
Here, Leo, just talk. Share with us. What have you got?
That's what he's not going to. What do you want to say? Get it out.
He's like, that's how it works. That's how stage fright is the definition of stage fright. I've got so much I want to talk about. Let me talk about all the things I want to talk about.
He's just going to say mom over and over again. Even though
until you point out to me that everybody's listening to me, then I have nothing to say. Dad, grandpa, grandma, brother, crayon up your nose. Okay, now you have my heart. Yes, you do. Yes, that is. All right. So, in the context, here we go. First, Leo, is there any background or commentary that you'd like to add to the story before we get started? All right, that'll go. That works. I mean, you're going to have it. You might as well play into it. Good timing, yes. Okay. So basically what you have is the people asking the question, who is Jesus? Who is this Jesus that we're dealing with? And some of them might have thought that, Leo. And but what happens is they're going back this whole, who is he? He says these things that are incredibly rich. People are responding to him. So you have this mixture of responses. And the people are saying, he can't be a prophet. He can't be the Messiah. He's from Galilee. Understand that, there have been others who've come to claim messiahship and they've been defeated. But in the situation of in this particular situation, what can we put in his mouth? That's great. All right. So anyway, Nazareth, you're a big boy. You know better, so you don't. All right. So they're having the conversation. Even to the point in verse 50, Nicodemus speaks up and tries to interject and kind of calm down this stirring rumble. The point of the matter is tension is beginning to build. And people are struggling with this. Who is this man who's disrupting the normal order of things? And so they begin a voice of protest. They begin to speak out and say what they know. And he can't be this. He must be this. He can't. Nicodemus has already had a private conversation with him a few chapters earlier. And he says, the one who came to him previously, Nicodemus says to them, are you fooled? Nicodemus, probably the police says stuff. And then they talk about stuff, the temple police. Then Nicodemus, the one who came to him previously, says, our law doesn't judge a man before he hears it from him and knows what he's doing, does it? And then they push back, you aren't from Galilee too, are you? Basically accusing him from being, the whole point is nothing good comes from Galilee. Jesus lived on the wrong side of the tracks, to use a modern equivalent, or the wrong side of town, or he was just from something or somewhere else. And he didn't make sense to anybody, so they went on. So chapter 8, verse 1 begins, so each went to his own house, but Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. So everyone went home at the end of the day. Jesus retreated up into the Mount of Olives and spent some time with the Lord. Then the next day at dawn, he went to the temple complex, which is where this whole conversation happened the day before. So he's at the temple complex, and all the people were coming out to him. He sat down and he started doing what he did the day before. He's teaching. And so the Pharisees, the people who were going, this can't be the man, decided to contrive a plan to see if they couldn't entrap Jesus to demonstrate that to make their point. I'm right. This guy is not who he says he is, or who people are starting to say he is. Because Jesus isn't running around going, I'm the Messiah. Jesus was running around more on the lines of, hey guys, kind of just chill out about this. The time will be when it's right. It's not, he wasn't, that's an interesting thing, is that others had come before him who sought messiahship. Jesus is not seeking something he knows he already is. He just is being who he is. All right, so he went to the temple complex. All the people were coming to him. He sat down and began to teach them. Then the scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman caught in adultery, making her stand in the center. So they bring her in. They stand her in the middle of the room, in the middle of the area, and they say the following. Teacher, they said to him, this woman was caught in the act of committing adultery. In the law, Moses commands us to stone such a woman. So what do you say? They asked this to trap him in order that they might have evidence to accuse him. So Jesus stooped down and started writing on the ground with his finger. Now when they persisted in questioning him, he stood up and said to them, the one without sin among you should be the first to throw a stone at her. Then he stooped down again and continued writing on the ground. Now when they heard this, they left one by one, starting with the older men. Then only he was left, with the woman still standing in the center. I think it's interesting. It points out there, she's still right there where she stood. She does nothing but stands still. And it says she's standing here, so we'll go with that. With the woman, it says she was with the woman in the center. It doesn't say anything about her posture. When Jesus stood up, he said to her, woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you? No one, she answered. Neither do I condemn you, said Jesus. Go, and from now on do not sin anymore. Then Jesus spoke to them again. I am the light of the world. Anyone who follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. Now, again, he's not saying I'm Messiah. He's just basically saying I'm God. Pay attention to what's going on here. He's putting out a message of authority in the middle of all this, but he's not. What I found interesting in this is how little Jesus says in the middle and the beginning of this story, but then how much everyone else says. And it's not that they're saying a lot in the text in the way that John has recorded it. It's that they're saying a lot implied in the text. And so we'll take a look at it. So we have the conflict. Conflict arises, first off. Let's talk about what causes conflict. Ready for this? This is my definition of conflict. Conflict arises when we already have our hearts set on something we believe is true, leaning on our own understanding alone and reinforcing it only with those who agree with us. Let me say that again. I think I should say it again. All right, I'm going to say it for you, Leo. Pay attention. Conflict arises when we have already set in our hearts something is true, leaning on our own understanding alone and reinforcing it with only those who agree with us. Think about it. How many times have you had an argument with someone when your first response when they spoke back to you was, "That's interesting, I hadn't considered that before"? Most of the time it's like, no, that's not true. This is what I think is true. That's the conflict. That's what's happening here. That's what's happening in chapter 7. They're having this, who do you say he is? Well, I think, what if he's it? Well, we can't. Well, what if we judge? What, are you from Galilee too? They're having a battle. They're having this conflict because everyone has their own idea about who Jesus is supposed to be, about who God, the Messiah, is supposed to be. And Jesus doesn't fit the profile for some of them, but he actually fits the profile for a lot of the other ones, and they're not quite sure, others not quite sure what to do with them. And that, my friends, is the source of a large political conflict. Because for them, that was politics. Religion and politics are not separate. They're here together. There's a theocracy in their minds. They may live under the authority of Rome, but for these people, God is king and Lord, and they're trying to figure out the politics of how they should function within a society that's ruled by him. And so they see this inevitability. When you have this idea in your heart that you believe something is true, when you're leaning on your own understanding alone, you're only reinforcing it with people who agree with you, then inevitably there's going to be a wall somewhere along the line that you're going to come crashing into. Okay? And generally, while it may be, it's going to be in the form of a person. It's also important to realize that conflict may be very well Jesus standing right in front of you, halting you in your tracks. So chapter 8, verses 3 through 5 says, "The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman caught in adultery, making her stand in the center. 'Teacher,' they said to him, 'this woman was caught in the act of committing adultery. In the law, Moses condemns us to stone such a woman. What do you say?'" Now, they didn't come asking this question presupposing that Jesus was going to give the answer they agreed with. They came thinking they were going to trip him up, that they were going to entrap him. That was the whole point of it. So here's the point. Here's the thing. Ready, Leo? Leo, look at Grandpa. You ready? Number 2. When you're set in your own understanding, you're not looking for the truth of a situation. You're looking to make your point. You hear me, Leo? I'm going to say it again for you and for you alone. When you're set in your own understanding, you are not looking for the truth of a situation. You're looking to make your point. And verse 6 says that. They asked this in order to trap him, that they might have evidence to accuse him. They were not interested in finding out who Jesus was. They had already set in their own hearts, in their own minds, their own understanding of what the Messiah, who the Messiah was. This is the conflict that's laid to bear. The conflict is not who is Jesus. The conflict is here's who the Messiah we think he's supposed to be. This Jesus is irrelevant. He's obviously not the guy because he's not following the plan. Let me rephrase that. He's not following my plan. He's not following the plan I had in mind. And so there's chatter, there's noise, and so the conflict leads to the chatter. And I want to say that while I just explained to you there's a whole lot of gossip and chatter in previous chapter 7, there's a different kind of chatter that I want to point to right here. Because while these people in chapter 7 were all trying to understand who Jesus was, the folks here are not trying to get to understand. The chatter is not trying to get to understand who Jesus was. They'd already had this long conversation before they got there about what to do with this woman. They'd been talking among themselves, chattering about how they were going to form a protest that was not in a search for truth, but in a search to entrap the enemy. And the enemy was Jesus. They're not looking for a response. They're looking for evidence. Think about that for a second. When you're in an argument, when someone's struggling with you, you're not really looking for understanding. You're looking to prove your point. You're looking to make your way. When you have a conflict, it's because you're stuck in your own thoughts and you won't let someone else poke at those thoughts or draw them into question because they're settled in you. And so as a result of that, you don't look for the truth of a situation. You wind up looking to make your point and you build an evidence. I'm not looking when I'm fighting or arguing with someone to find out what the truth is. I'm looking to build evidence to continue to make my point. That's what escalates an argument. And that's
I would say right the opposite of what you're saying.
Okay.
Conflict.
Fight me. Go for it.
Well, but no, I'm just saying you're not in conflict if you're surrounding yourself with everyone who agrees with you.
Mm-hmm.
So what you're saying is we shouldn't invoke conflict, because that wouldn't be what's going on. There's no conflict until there is.
Right. This is where I'm going with it. So there's the conflict
So
is
this
happening.
So
So
that's not technically the conflict. The conflict will happen. This happens as they confront someone who doesn't agree with them, right? Most people prefer to live in,
they've okay.
had those families
Right.
where they don't like conflict, which means they don't like to disagree, I guess,
Right.
which is
Yeah.
unreasonable for any
Sounds like
normal
quite a
life.
buildup of probably something that might explode later if you're just suppressing and ignoring what might potentially be a conflict.
Right. When I say the conflict here, I'm pointing to chapter 7. I'm saying the conflict begins in chapter 7, and there already is a conflict. You have the people saying, "Who is Jesus?" So you go back to chapter 7, and you see they're having this battle where even Nicodemus jumps in, and there's not a conflict that's coming from between them and Jesus at this point. They're having an argument among themselves. The debate over Jesus' claims, verse 45. The temple police came, the chief priests and Pharisees, who asked him, "Why haven't you brought him?" The police said, "No man has ever spoken like this." Then the Pharisees responded, "Are you fooled too? Have any of the rulers believed in him, or are the Pharisees?" Now, it's interesting because they say, "Have any of the rulers believed in him, or any of the Pharisees?" But this crowd who doesn't know the law is accursed. So they're basically saying the crowd's believing in him, but they're not religious leaders. And then what happens is Nicodemus, one of the rulers in the room, says, But don't we hold off judging someone until they've been proven to be a certain way?" And they say, "What are you, from Galilee too?" So then they throw a ruler under the bus. And so that's when I'm talking about conflict. I'm talking about there is a conflict, and so they decide to move from having this battle among themselves to throw in front of them to demonstrate that Jesus is wrong. And so they create and want to press the conflict to the next level. And they run into Jesus, because I'm getting to the point of how this chatter builds. Because what's happening is, to my definition earlier, conflict arises. They already have something set in their hearts that something's true. And when something challenges that,
That's what I
but that's the
Because
second
that's
part. When you set in your own understanding, you're not looking for truth. You're looking to make your point. But you're going to be
conflict hasn't
challenged. You're
come,
going to
though,
hit a
until you're
wall.
gonna get challenged. Yeah.
Well, but here's the thing in chapter 7. They've already had some conflict. Now they're going to make their point by throwing Jesus under the bus, by giving him an impossible question. Do you see what I'm saying? So they're having conflict among themselves, and then Jesus comes in and stirs the pot, because the wall that they run into, they think is going to be someone they can maybe run over. So they give a hard question to, and then what they find in return is someone who just draws in the dirt. Because Jesus catches it like an egg. And it's interesting, and that's where, so the chatter is here. They're trying to, in chapter 7, they're trying to understand who he is, but the chatter that's happening here is they're building their case in their own heart and mind, right? They're trying to provoke a response to Jesus. That's what he says. So they're causing more conflict. They're escalating the conflict. Here, John 8:6. So Jesus responds to it by doing nothing. He squats down in the dirt. There's this woman who's accused. He squats down and he starts writing on the ground with his finger. So here's what I'm talking about, the chatter. So they kept at him, it says. They keep talking. They keep persisting. All right? So it's like a protester who won't let me redirect the question. I still am drawn back to the one time that I saw some kid get in the face of a anti-abortion or pro-life protester downtown, and I pulled up the car and said, "Hey man, you're going to hurt that old man." He actually hit the old man. I wound up calling the police, said this guy's pushing the guy's sign. He's causing it, because that's illegal. You can't protest in our country allows for people to have differing opinions, even to yell at one another, but not to make contact. And so I did 3 or 4 years ago, and I found myself trying to take the Jesus approach. I asked the guy what he was dealing with, and he started telling me all this stuff. And I go, "Well, what if they disagree?" And I just asked the question, and he just got more belligerent, restated, says, "I'm not here," he said, "I'm not here to find meaning. I'm here to protest." That's what he said to me. And I went, "Well, then you're wasting your time." And he got mad and stormed off, because the man had been sitting there for years. This kid showed up a weekend, and guess what? The man's still down there, because he's sincerely making his point. The other person was just there to cause trouble. And what happens here is these people were here to protest. They were here to say to Jesus, we want to show the world that you're a fool and you're not who you say you are. And so that's what happened. And so Jesus just stoops down and doesn't answer them. He holds his tongue. Now, I'm going to point out here in a second that he's taught a lot already, but he doesn't say anything in this point. What had he done the day before? He had been teaching in the temple. He'd been doing it in such a great way, and the people were coming, people were getting healed, people were stirring and beginning to ask the question, could this be the Messiah? And then there's an argument that happens between the crowds and the religious leaders, and the religious leaders said, do you see any religious leaders? And then Nicodemus goes, well, actually, I'm one. And they go, what are you, a Gentile too? A Galilean too, excuse me. Might as well have called him a Gentile. And so they're trying to provoke this response from Jesus. He kneels down, and they keep talking. They persist. This is where the protesters, what do protesters do? They stand there and they repeat their statement over and over and over again. Or they make their statement. And I had this image that at this point, this woman's on the ground, and Jesus sits down and he begins to draw on the ground, but they don't shut up. It's not like they make the question. This is the way we read the text sometimes, right? They make the question, and then suddenly there's an awkward silence for a bit of time till someone asks the question again, and then Jesus gets... But I have this idea. It says, when they persisted, they continued to persist, which means they may have been reframing the question or asking the question or going, what up? Come on, answer. Let me know. Come on, what are you doing? They could have just been, verbally pushing him. But the point of the matter is there's chatter. There's conversation. They're going on to say, we want you to prove us right. We're right. You're not. We're right. You're not. And it's going on. And that's what happens when you're set in your own ways and your ears are turned off and your heart is closed tight and all you want to do is be right. You're going to continue to make sure that there's nothing but your noise in the void to keep someone from actually speaking truth.
It's just called media.
It's called media. Yeah, it could be called media easily. And so that's the chatter. Keep talking, keep getting in the way. And so Proverbs 18:2 says this, a fool does not delight in understanding, but only to show off his own opinions. If you got to commit a verse to memory, everyone should commit this one. Proverbs 18:2, a fool does not delight in understanding, but only wants to show off his opinions. That's not implying that it's just boys. Fools can be boys and girls. And whatever others moncure you want to throw out there. So anyway, a fool is someone who just wants to air his own opinions. And so it's a pattern that's there, and they continue to press and air their own opinions about these things. And who knows, they were notorious for arguing with one another. They could have been having an argument with one another while Jesus was there over this thing. But Jesus just kept there and stayed quiet. So what's a good response to someone who's pressing you? Well, first off, be quiet. Mm-hmm. Shut your mouth. Don't fight back. Draw in the dirt. What I think is interesting is he doesn't just respond. He draws in the dirt a little bit. He does something that's like confusing. It doesn't make sense in the moment that he's doing what he's doing. He just kind of does something specifically different. And so they do that, and then he gets pressed, and then he says, and he does a good thing. He distracts them. He's patient with them. And then he gives them permission to judge. He waited for a good time to respond till they were out of gas, I guess is another way to phrase it. Sometimes you got to just wait for the person to be out of gas. And then he gives them a permission to judge them. But specifically, he gives them permission to judge them, but not before first asking them to judge themselves. It's easy to judge others if you don't look at yourself first. If you look at yourself, the reason our court system requires a jury of our peers and others that are like us is because if you put a group of people together, it's more likely that they're going to look into their own hearts before they look at someone else. And the case that's being made before them in a courtroom is a case that's trying to have sympathy for the plaintiff or the defendant, and to ask people to truly look at the hearts. That's our own legal system. But Jesus is basically saying, okay, you crowd, you jury of people who are not at all this woman's peers. If you want to judge her, go ahead. But take a look in your own heart first. Now, he's not just doing this out of thin air. This isn't a new thing. Jesus is doing something that's incredibly wise. He reminds them what the Bible says, what the Torah says. First, he points them to Leviticus 19:18. Do not take revenge or bear a grudge against members of your community, but love your neighbor as yourself. That right there is a foundational statement that builds all the law and the prophets, as Jesus says in Matthew 22, 39 through 40. The second like it, loving the Lord your God with all your heart, and then love your neighbor as yourself. He says in verse 40, all the law and the prophets depend on these two commands. Love God, love your neighbor. But even more so, in Luke, he says it again, Luke 6:31, just as you want others to do for you, do the same for them. He's taking this one thing in Leviticus and he's giving different he has been giving over the course of his ministry different teachings. But if you really want to dig into it, go to Matthew 7, 1 through 6. And Jesus has likely already taught this. It's probably something that's already known in the area, where he basically is making a commentary on how we judge one another. Do not judge, verse 7, verses 1 through 6. Do not judge so that you won't be judged. For with the judgment you use, you will be judged. Now think back on Matthew 22:39, Leviticus 19:18, Luke 6:31. Just as you want others to treat you, so also treat them. Do the same for them. Love your neighbor as yourself. That's again saying what? If you're loving your neighbor as yourself, you're thinking about how you treat your neighbor in relationship to how you treat yourself. Exactly. And that goes all the way back to what they would be more familiar with. If they had memorized the previous sermons of Jesus of late, they would know Leviticus 19. Don't revenge or bear grudge against member, but love your neighbor as yourself. This is not a new thing. It's a commentary on a thing. Or should I say what God does for us is he takes something that's always been there, and as we open our heart up and allow God to speak to us, what happens is something that is there suddenly gains clarity. We become clear-eyed. And that's what happens. And I think that's most evident in what happens. As soon as he's done with that, he stoops down again and starts writing on the ground again. And then all of a sudden, the older people are where it all begins to fall apart. Because you know what? Old people have history. They're not wandering around in ignorance. And so they're the first ones to walk away and drop the stones. Let's see if there's something.
I think it's incredibly applicable that Matthew passage is, it's always saying that the speck in your eye is a log.
Yes.
When you can't you can't help someone who you won't even notice their issue, because a speck in your eye no one else can see.
Right.
But that person's hurting from that. They'll ask you to help. Once you've removed the log, that's huge, and everyone can see in your own.
Mm-hmm. And that's the beauty of it. You know, is Jesus is saying is. If you look at it, you think, right, so what are they doing in the speck, right? You're considering the log in the other person's eye, you won't see the speck in someone else's eye, you won't see the log in your own eye. You're willing to look around something huge in order to accuse something else. That's what Jesus is saying there. Don't be a hypocrite. You're willing to overlook a ton of crap in your own heart in order to accuse someone you're ticked off at because they're not agreeing with your worldview.
I agree with that statement, but I don't think that illustration, I think you can't see someone's speck in their eye. I can't see.
No, I agree. That's what I'm saying. So what Jesus...
You have to tell me you're in pain or you're struggling, you need help. Right? I mean, I'm just saying that's another angle on that.
That is.
Truth.
That's
you're right.
That's it, yes.
But that we have to look around our own huge issues. But the illustration is that everyone can see it. It's displayed. It's a huge log.
Yeah.
Whereas that little speck that's got someone else has, they need to ask you for help for. You won't even know it's there until they ask you, because they're in pain.
Yeah, I think that's yeah, I don't disagree with that. That's right.
Well, just like you said, it's about, Jesus said to those men, first think about your own, first
look at your own self.
your own self.
Well, so here's the story. But in this case, right, we have what? We have a prostitute that's been a woman caught in adultery who's been thrown before the feet of Jesus. And so the speck is out there. And by no evidentiary mark is someone caught in adultery a speck. It's a huge crime in the culture, right? And it's not a huge crime in our culture today, but it is a huge crime in the culture. It's really a huge crime against God, right? Just the unfaithfulness is a huge crime. And so, yes, he's saying that, and the principle he's building on is what we find in Matthew 7. He's saying you can't even begin to see someone else's. You're saying unless they ask. I'm saying that in this case,
their struggle shouldn't be obvious to you because, like you said,
yeah, if you're truly heart-centric, if you're truly self-aware, this is about self-awareness. I was going to just touch on that later, but to bring it up, no, that's fine. To bring it up now is to say, if you're not fully aware, if you're not God-aware, you can't be self-aware, okay? And so God-awareness equals self-awareness, which allows you to be aware of others, okay? So what Jesus is basically saying to them is, hey, examine your own heart before God before you apply judgment to another person, right?
And I think so you can give them grace, then you'll see it as the pain they're in, not the...
Right.
Judgment.
And that's what Jesus, that's the cure. And that's the end of this. That's where Jesus brings it back around to the woman who's there. And I find that interesting too. So don't judge that you won't be judged, for with judgment you use will be judged. And you said, brought up verse 3, why do you look the speck in your brother's eye, but don't notice the log in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me remove the speck, and look, there's a log in your eye? Don't be a hypocrite. First take the log out of your eye, then you can see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. Don't give what is holy to dogs, or toss your pearls before a pig, or they will trample them with feet, turn and tear you to pieces. And so basically that last statement is Jesus saying, by the way, no matter what you do, there's some people who are just swine about it, and they're just going to tear it apart and do it. So he stoops down, verse 8, and he continues to write on the ground. And then it says, and continues, it says, they left, verse 9, when they heard this, they left one by one, starting with the older men. Only he was left with the woman and the center. So the conflict that's happening here is that they ran into Jesus and they had not yet been asked to face themselves. They ran into Jesus and they had not yet been asked to face themselves. And so Jesus basically stood up and said, you know, you guys have given me this problem to solve, but let's just say, you know what you want to do, so go ahead and do it. But first, ask yourself this question. Are you without sin? He gave them permission to be judges. And I think that's interesting. He gave them permission to be judges. He gives us permission to judge. People who say, you can't judge me. You're right. I can't judge you unless first I've looked in my own heart and I'm coming at you with love and grace, which is what happens in the story. Even though it's against the desire of the men in the room that day, they walked out humiliated. But what's important to understand is the judgment of Jesus in that moment, acting as a judge who put to them the question, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, is there undeniable proof that your hearts are not also corrupt? Basically. They left judging her clean. That's powerful. They had no choice but to walk out of their own, quote, conviction that they came in there with, that they were going to prove Jesus wrong. Not only that, they were going to make their point that they were authoritarian and right. Jesus just undercut them entirely. They ran straight into Jesus because after he made that statement, he knelt down again and began to write on the ground. Now, if they start throwing rocks at her, guess who else they're throwing rocks at? Now, there's no real clear evidence that he's sitting right next to her, but he was in the room teaching, so there's a probability that he might have been. He was writing in the dirt and squatting down. Pretty sure she was probably sitting in the dirt or laying in the dirt, wondering what he was writing. I don't know if it was me, and she was close enough to see I'll be writing something along the line. It's going to be okay. Just be patient, be calm, keep quiet. But that's just because I, like the Pharisees, talk a little too much. Jesus was quiet. He wrote on the ground. And so then they leave one by one. They walk away and they get away. And then Jesus looks at the woman and he stands up and he says to her, women, where are they? Has no one condemned you? No one, Lord, she answers. Then neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on, do not sin anymore. Now, he doesn't ignore that something had gone on. He doesn't ignore that there's been sin in her life. But what he does is he extends mercy and forgiveness. Now, one of the things our culture is desperately lacking right now is mercy and forgiveness. We don't want to hear each other, and we don't want to understand each other, but even more so, we don't want to understand something that we don't already agree with. This woman knew she was a dead woman. She was convinced of it. She thought for sure that was going to happen. But one person in that room who didn't walk away, who didn't drop a stone, who arguably never picked one up, didn't judge her either. He had the right to. He made the law. The law they were quoting, God wrote. And he chose, the one person who had the right to judge her chose, I want to emphasize, chose not to. Super important to understand that. If you ever want to understand the cure, we have to understand the heart of God is big enough to provide a way of forgiveness for all of us, to provide a hope for all of us that there is someone, something greater than us out here who can make way for our redemption. Last year at this time, because I looked at sermons I did last year, I talked about Pelagius and Aristotle. and there being an argument between them as to the nature of humanity. Aristotle arguing total depravity, and Pelagius making the argument that there was some good in us. I concluded that message by saying that if you're struggling with being able to forgive others and forgive yourself, you may be a little more Pelagian than you should be. Because if you believe that you have the power within you to be good, then you have the power within you to save yourself. And this woman and Jesus were the only two people in that room that were totally self-aware. And you know what self-aware people don't do? They don't argue. They don't make a case. She knew she was doomed. She said nothing. She didn't beg for her life. It wasn't until he addressed her that she responded. And then she just had no one. And in that moment, the only one who could judge her didn't. In that moment, the only one that could release her did. She didn't walk out of there thinking there was anything good about her. She didn't walk out of there thinking she could have saved herself. There was nothing in that moment that could have saved her. Except Jesus. And my, what a Christmas story. They're all good Christmas stories when you really take a look at them. That introspection, taking a look at your own heart and seeing how you stand before the judge above you. It's the only pathway to self-awareness. It's the only way to shut you up. I think so oftentimes we're so busy arguing. Okay, now I want to tell you, I was studying, this actually flowed out of a personal quiet time I wrote down. At the beginning of my quiet time, spirit-filled messages come out of spirit-filled men. And then I started to apologize to God for not feeling very spirit-filled this week. And then it was just something was going on in my heart. And then I read this passage, and then I wrote at the bottom of it, boy, you like to let us babble. Because I babbled on and on in the beginning of my thing, and it was just this circular prayer. I don't know if you guys ever get into circular prayers, but I get into circular prayers sometimes. And I realize, Lord, all I'm doing is going on and on about something that I just need to say, I'm sorry, forgive me, and heal me for a heart that's broken. And I said, boy, you let me babble. And then I realized as I read this text that the Pharisees and the religious leaders were so busy making their own point, they never paused long enough to let Jesus heal anyone, including the woman in the room that day. Instead, he left everyone thinking hard about who they really were and who he really is. And I think that's how I want to live my life. I want to live my life in a way that leads people to think hard about who they really are and who Jesus really is. And I pray that for all of us because, boy, we can get in our own ways when we just chatter on and on and on about how right we are and try to prove ourselves to others. When all Jesus wants to do is stand up and say, hey, I have a question. And remind us. This is what he does. He reminded them of what the Word of God already said. If you are willing to judge yourself with stoning, go ahead and stone her. Remember, do unto others as you would hope that they would do unto you. Look at your own heart, your own sin. Have you ever done anything worthy of stoning? Have you ever thought something, done something, hidden something, covered over something, buried something? Have you ever crossed a line you shouldn't have crossed, said and done something you shouldn't have done? If that's not true of you, if there's nothing in your life that doesn't line up with the Scripture, if you are perfect in every single way and you're not so busy talking in order to keep people from seeing the sin in your heart, that's why we talk too much, is to cover the stuff in our heart. At least it's one reason. What do we call it? I think in today's news world we use it as we need to redirect the narrative. And I think that politicians have learned it well. If they keep talking about something they want you to hear, maybe you won't hear or see what they don't want you to see. The problem is with Psalm 139. I told you I wanted to read that today, and I want to close with that. Because God knows us, and there is nowhere we can hide from him. It's a beautiful psalm, but it's also a dangerous psalm. Because he is the all-knowing, ever-present God. Verse 1, Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I stand up. You understand my thoughts from far away. You observe my travels, you observe my rest, and you're aware of all my ways. Before a word is on my tongue, you know about it, Lord. What about when Jesus said he didn't bother with some things because he already knew what was in their hearts? Because you know about it, Lord. You've encircled me. You've placed your hand on me. This extraordinary knowledge is beyond me. It's lofty. I'm unable to reach it. Where can I go to escape your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go to heaven, you're there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I live at the eastern horizon or settle at the western limits, even there your hand will lead me. Your right hand will hold on to me. I say, surely darkness can hide me and the light around me will become night. Even the darkness is not dark to you. The night skies are like the day. Darkness and light are alike to you. For it was you who created the inmost parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I will praise you because I have been remarkably and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful, and I know this well. That's the part of this psalm we like to put onto pieces of paper and post on the wall so we can feel special. But this psalm is challenging as deeply as it is special, because he keeps going, my bones, they were not hidden from you. When I was made in secret, when I was formed in the depths of the earth, your eyes saw me. I was formless. All my days were written in your book and planned before a single one of them began. God, how difficult your thoughts are for me to comprehend. We started with what? God, you know my thoughts before they ever come off my tongue, or they're even formed on my tongue, but I can't even begin to comprehend you. God, how difficult your thoughts are for me to comprehend, how vast their sum is. If I counted them, they would outnumber the grains of sand. When I wake up, I am still with you. God, if only you would wipe out the wicked, the bloodthirsty men, keep them away from me. You who invoke you deceitfully, your enemies swear by you falsely. Lord, I don't hate those. Don't I hate those that hate you and detest those who rebel against you? I hate them with extreme hatred. I consider them my enemies. But he doesn't stop there. How does he end it? He turns to the log in his own eye and he says, search me, God, and know my heart. Test me and know my concerns. See if there's any offensive way in me and lead me in the everlasting way. Guys, the Pharisees that day had this psalm memorized. So when Jesus makes that reference, it doesn't just take them to Leviticus. It doesn't take them to sermons Jesus has already preached. It takes them through the entire scriptures that was in their hearts. And Jesus is merely asking the same question that David asks here. Search yourself. Take a look. Let God look into your heart and be known. And if you do that, God will show you how to put the stone down and follow the rock, who is Jesus. Father, thank you for your love for us and your presence in our time together. And Lord, I just ask you to help us to deal with the conflict in our own hearts and the chatter that comes out of our mouth as I ramble on in my quiet time trying to make my point to you, and sometimes find myself standing there with stone in hand being chastised and reminded that I am just as in need of looking inward as I am of looking outward, as I judge those around me, as I can't see clearly those who would want to, in my mind, be enemies that destroy. And as David prays here, Lord, that I would pray out loud, take them out, take out my enemies. But Lord, I ask you like he did, Father, search me and know me. See if there's any wicked way within me and cleanse me from all unrighteousness. And I may walk in your truth. And I may walk in the everlasting way. Forgive me, Lord. I want to put my rock down. In Jesus' name. Let's worship.